They look at my rough, grease-stained hands and see a mediocre airplane mechanic. For 18 years, I let the Vane family believe I was a useless old man. But Cornelius does not know this is just camouflage. Tonight he plans to discard me like scrap metal, forgetting a basic rule of mechanics. If you compress a spring too tight, it snaps back. Before I reveal how I secretly own $15 billion of his company, drop a comment below. You are about to learn why you never judge a book by its cover. My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I am 64 years old, and if you saw me walking down the street in my stained flannel shirt and work boots, you would likely cross to the other side to avoid the smell of old motor oil and solitude. I was standing in the center of my garage, a converted barn that sat 100 yards from the main house, holding a fuel metering valve for a 1962 turbojet engine. The garage was my sanctuary, a place where the laws of physics were the only laws that mattered. Outside these walls, in the manicured world of Greenwich, Connecticut status, was determined by the year of your car and the pedigree of your spaniel. Inside here, status was determined by precision. I held the valve up to the singular halogen bulb hanging from the rafters. To the untrained eye, it was just a piece of machined steel, dull and heavy. To me, it was a masterpiece of fluid dynamics. I was resurfacing the needle seat, a task that required a tolerance of less than 3 microns. If I was off by even the width of a human hair, the fuel mixture would be too rich at 30,000 feet. The combustion chamber would overheat, and the pilot would have a very bad day. I adjusted my jeweler's loop, took a breath, and applied the diamond paste to the lapping tool. The motion was rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Circular, steady pressure. I could feel the metal yielding, microscopically smoothing out under my fingertips. This is what the Vane family saw when they looked at me. They saw the grease under my fingernails that no amount of pumice soap could ever fully scrub away. They saw the way I favored my right leg when the weather turned cold, a souvenir from a test stand accident 30 years ago. They saw a man who fixed things that other people threw away. To my father-in-law, Cornelius Vane, and his circle of high society sharks, I was a mechanic, a tinkerer, a man who worked with his hands because he presumably lacked the intellect to work with his mind. They believed I spent my days changing oil filters on neighborhood sedans and welding broken lawnmower decks for spare cash. They were wrong. They did not know that the valve I was currently calibrating was based on a flow control design I had patented 25 years ago. They did not know that the royalties from that single patent alone generated $3 million a year. They did not know that the mechanic standing in this drafty garage was the silent architect behind the variable cycle propulsion systems that powered half the military fleet Cornelius was currently trying to sell to the Pentagon. I was not just fixing the engine. I had invented the principles that made it fly. But I never told them. I kept the patents buried under layers of shell companies, blind trusts, and legal firewalls. To the world and to my wife, I was just Arthur the old man who liked to get his hands dirty. I set the valve down on the workbench, wiping my hands on a rag that was already black with grime. Through the dusty window, I saw headlights sweep across the driveway. It was not the warm yellow glow of a neighbor dropping by. It was the harsh blue-white LED piercing of a late-model luxury sedan. Evelyn was home. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 6:45 in the evening. She was late. Again. I listened to the sound of her car door slamming shut. It was a solid, expensive thud. Then came the click-clack of her heels on the paved walkway. She bypassed the main house and came straight for the garage. She hated the garage. She hated the smell of solvent and the piles of scrap metal I kept for parts. If she was coming here first, it meant she had news she wanted to deliver quickly so she could retreat to the cleanliness of the house. The side door opened, letting in a gust of cold November air. Evelyn stood there, framed by the darkness outside. She was 45 years old, 19 years my junior, and she was still the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But it was a cold beauty now, like a marble statue that had been left out in the rain too long. She wore a charcoal gray coat that probably cost $4,000, cinched tight at the waist. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, not a strand out of place. "Arthur," she said. Her voice was flat. It lacked the melody it held 18 years ago when we first met. Back then, she was the rebellious daughter of an aerospace tycoon looking for something real. I was the older, rugged man who offered her a life outside the suffocating expectations of her father. Now, looking at her, I saw the rebellion had faded. The Vane blood had reclaimed her. "Hello, Evelyn," I said, keeping my voice low. I did not move toward her. I knew she did not want me to touch that $4,000 coat with my dirty hands. "You are home late." "Meeting with the estate planners," she said, not meeting my eyes. She looked around the garage with a familiar expression of distaste. Her eyes landed on my 1972 Triumph motorcycle in the corner, then moved to the rusted fender of my daily driver, a 2005 Ford F-150 pickup truck. It had 230,000 miles on the odometer and a dent in the tailgate from when I backed into a loading dock. She hated that truck. She said it was an embarrassment to park it in the driveway of a Greenwich estate. She wanted me to drive the Range Rover she had leased for me, but I preferred the Ford. It was honest. "We have dinner on Friday," she said abruptly. I picked up a wrench just to have something to hold. "We just had dinner with your parents 2 weeks ago. I thought we were on a monthly rotation." "It is a special occasion," she said. She finally looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes was not affection. It was not even anger. It was exhaustion. It was the look of someone who has been carrying a heavy suitcase for miles and has finally decided to drop it on the side of the road. My father insisted. 7 o'clock. Friday. Vane Manor. "Is it a birthday?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Is it an anniversary?" "No," she said. She pulled her coat tighter, though it was warm in the garage near the heater. "It is just a family matter. Julian Thorne will be there." I paused. Julian Thorne. The name tasted like bile. He was 38 years old, a hedge fund manager with perfect teeth, a pedigree from Wharton, and a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was the man Cornelius Vane had always wanted for Evelyn. He was the man Evelyn was currently spending a lot of lunches with. "Why is Julian coming to a family dinner?" I asked. "He is advising Daddy on the merger," Evelyn said, the lie slipping out easily practiced. "He is part of the inner circle now. Please, Arthur, just wear the suit I bought you, the blue one, and try to scrub your hands. Daddy made a comment last time about your fingernails." "I work for a living, Evelyn," I said. "Grease is part of the job." "You do not have to work." She snapped a flash of the old fire coming through, but it was twisted now. "You choose to work in this hovel. You choose to embarrass us." "I choose to stay busy," I corrected her. "There is a difference." She sighed, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had appeared. She looked at me, really looked at me for a second. For a moment I thought I saw a flicker of regret. Maybe she was remembering the nights we spent in my small apartment in the city before we moved back here to be near her sick mother. Before the Vane gravity pulled her back in. But then the shutter came down. The business mask slid back into place. "Friday," she repeated. 7 o'clock. "Do not be late. And Arthur, do not drive the truck. Please." She turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind her. I stood there in the silence, listening to her heels retreat toward the main house. I looked down at the fuel valve in my hand. I knew exactly what Friday was. I analyzed human behavior with the same rigor I applied to mechanical engineering. I looked for stress fractures. I looked for fatigue points. I looked for the telltale signs of structural failure. The invitation was not social. The presence of Julian Thorne confirmed that. The formality of the request confirmed that. And Evelyn's demeanor, the detachment, the lack of eye contact, the specific request for me to dress up, It all pointed to one conclusion. This was not a dinner. This was a dismissal. I set the valve down on the soft cloth. I walked over to the small refrigerator in the corner and pulled out a bottle of water. I sat on the stool, my joints popping as I settled my weight. I was 64 years old. I felt every year of it tonight. For 18 years I had played a game. A very expensive, very dangerous game. When I met Evelyn, I was already wealthy. Not just comfortable, but wealthy on a scale that Cornelius Vane would have envied if he knew the truth. But I had seen what money did to people. I had seen how it corroded relationships, how it turned love into a transaction. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to know that if a woman loved me, she loved Arthur, the man, not Arthur, the patent holder, not Arthur, the majority shareholder. So I created the persona. Arthur Penhaligon, the mechanic. The consultant who specialized in vintage restoration. It was not entirely a lie. I did love restoring old machines. But it was a filter. It filtered out the gold diggers. It filtered out the social climbers. And for a while, it worked. Evelyn fell in love with the rugged, quiet man who listened to her and made her feel safe. She rebelled against her father's world of superficiality and chose me. But entropy is a universal law. Everything declines. Systems degrade. Energy dissipates. Over the last 5 years, I had watched the corrosion set in. The constant pressure from her parents. The whispers at the country club. The slow grinding realization that she was married to a man who in her eyes had no ambition. She did not know that my ambition was satisfied decades ago when I solved the problem of hypersonic combustion stability. She just saw a man who was content to fix old carburetors while her friends' husbands were buying islands. I had stayed silent. I had stayed in character. I told myself I was protecting us. I told myself I was keeping our life pure. But sitting there in the dim light of the garage with the smell of oil and metal in my nose, I realized I had made a miscalculation. A fatal error. I had tested the material of her character for too long under too much load. And now it had finally snapped. Friday was the end. I knew it in my gut. Cornelius was going to make his move. He needed capital for his new military contracts I knew were based on flawed science, because I had reviewed the preliminary schematics under my alias. He needed to secure his legacy, and he needed to get rid of the embarrassing son-in-law who drove a rusted Ford. I looked at my hands. They were large, scarred, and stained black. They were the hands of a worker. But inside the mind connected to these hands was the knowledge of how to build a jet engine from scratch, and more importantly, the knowledge of how to dismantle one. I stood up and wiped my hands one last time. If they wanted a show on Friday, I would give them one. I would drive the Ford. I would wear the flannel. I would be exactly the man they despised right up until the moment I became the man they feared. I reached into the pocket of my work pants and pulled out a small secure flash drive. It contained the latest financial reports from my private holding company, the Black Hawk Fund. I had not looked at the total in a few days. I knew the market had been volatile. I plugged it into the ruggedized laptop on my workbench. The screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow over the tools. I typed in a 64-character encryption key. The spreadsheet loaded. My eyes scanned the bottom line. The total value of my liquid assets and equity holdings: $15,420,600,000. I closed the laptop. I walked to the door and turned off the light, plunging the garage into darkness. I was ready for Friday. I had been preparing for Friday for a very long time, even if I had hoped it would never come. I stepped out into the cold night air, leaving the ghost of the engineer in the dark, and walked toward the house to play the role of the tired old mechanic one last time. They thought they were inviting a victim to dinner. They had no idea they were inviting the executioner. The silence inside the cab of my 2005 Ford F-150 was louder than the engine, which was saying something considering the exhaust manifold had developed a hairline fracture I had been meaning to weld for 3 weeks. We were hurtling down the Merritt Parkway, the darkness of the Connecticut woods pressing in on either side of the highway, but the real darkness was sitting right there in the passenger seat. Evelyn refused to look at me. She sat rigid, her posture perfect, her knees angled away from the center console, as if she were afraid that touching any part of my world would contaminate her pristine evening gown. The heater hummed blowing air that smelled faintly of old dust and pine, a scent I found comforting, but which I knew made her wrinkle her nose in that subtle aristocratic way she had perfected over the last decade. I had defied her request. I had not taken the Range Rover. I had taken the truck. It was a petty act of rebellion, perhaps, but it was also a test. I wanted to see if she would refuse to get in. She had hesitated in the driveway for a full 30 seconds, her hand hovering over the door handle, her eyes darting toward the neighbors' houses to see if anyone was witnessing her humiliation. But in the end, the fear of being late to her father's summons outweighed her embarrassment of being seen in a 20-year-old work truck. She had climbed in, pulled her coat tight, and had not spoken a word since we left the driveway. I glanced over at her. The dashboard lights cast a green pallor over her face, highlighting the tension in her jaw. She was beautiful, objectively speaking, but it was the beauty of a diamond that has been cut too sharp it catches the light, but it can also cut you if you handle it wrong. Seeing her like this, encased in her armor of high fashion and cold silence, it was hard to reconcile her with the woman I had met 19 years ago. My mind drifted back to that night in a dive bar in New Haven. It was raining a torrential downpour that turned the gutters into rivers. She had burst through the door soaking wet, her expensive dress ruined mascara running down her cheeks. She had just walked out of her own engagement party, an engagement to a man her father had chosen a merger rather than a marriage. She had sat down next to me at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and told me she hated them all. She hated the pretense, she hated the money, she hated the way everyone she knew looked at price tags before they looked at souls. I was just a mechanic then or so, she thought. I was drinking a cheap beer and reading a manual on fluid dynamics, the cover hidden inside a sports magazine. I listened to her. I did not judge her. I did not try to leverage her last name. I just offered her a dry towel from my gym bag and told her that engines were easier than people because engines never lied to you. If an engine was broken, it told you exactly why. She had laughed then, a real throaty laugh that made heads turn. She looked at my rough hands and saw safety. She looked at my old truck and saw freedom. Now she looked at the same hands and saw failure. She looked at the same truck and saw a cage. The irony was bitter. She had run to me to escape the vain world, but the vain world had a gravitational pull stronger than a black hole. It had taken time, years of slow erosion, of subtle comments from her mother, of financial comparisons from her friends, but eventually it had sucked her back in. And in the process, she had decided that I was the mistake she needed to correct. A soft chime from her side of the car broke the silence. She lifted her phone, the screen, illuminating her face with a harsh white light. Her thumb moved rapidly, scrolling, tapping. I kept my eyes on the road, navigating the curves, with the muscle memory of a man who understands torque and suspension limits. But my peripheral vision was sharp. I saw the app she was using. It was a financial news terminal. I saw the graph. It was a steep, jagged red line plunging downward. "Is the stock down again?" I asked, my voice gravelly. Evelyn stiffened. She did not look up. "It is just a market correction," she said, parroting the press release I knew her father had sent out that morning. "The sector is volatile." "It is not the sector, Evelyn," I said quietly. "It is the VX-10 turbine." She finally turned to look at me, her expression a mix of annoyance and dismissal. "What do you know about turbines, Arthur Stick, to changing oil?" "I know that when you use a nickel-chromium alloy with a grain structure that has not been properly heat-treated, It suffers from thermal creep at temperatures exceeding 1,400 degrees Celsius, I said. I kept my tone conversational, like I was discussing the weather. I know that Vane Aerospace skipped the tertiary vacuum melt process to save 4% on production costs. And I know that 3 days ago a test engine on the stand in Nevada disintegrated because the high-pressure blades elongated and struck the casing. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. For a second the mask slipped. Where did you hear that? I read, I said simply. Mechanics talk. It was a lie, of course. Mechanics did not talk about proprietary alloy failures in secret testing facilities. I knew because I was the one who had written the anonymous report to the board of directors 6 months ago, warning them that the alloy density was insufficient for the thrust-to-weight ratio they were promising the Pentagon. I had signed it, concerned shareholder. Cornelius Vane had ignored it. He was too focused on the quarterly earnings to worry about physics. Now the physics was coming to collect its debt, and the stock price was paying the interest. It is just a rumor, Evelyn said, turning back to her window. But her voice lacked conviction. She was terrified. If the VX-10 failed, the military contract would be voided. Vane Aerospace was leveraged to the hilt. Without that contract, the debt covenants would trigger, and the banks would come for everything, including the manor we were driving to. If it is just a rumor, then why is Julian Thorne coming to dinner? I asked. Hedge fund managers do not come for meatloaf unless they smell blood in the water. Stop it, she hissed. Just stop. Tonight is important. Daddy is under a lot of pressure. Do not make it worse with your conspiracy theories. Just eat your food, Smile, and try not to embarrass me. I am not the one who bought a company that builds flying bombs, I muttered, but I let it go. The exit for Greenwich was coming up. We turned off the highway and the world changed. The dense, chaotic woods gave way to manicured landscapes. Stone walls that cost more than my first house lined the winding road. The streetlights here were designed to look like old gas lamps, casting a soft golden glow that made everything look rich and timeless. We passed driveways that were 1/4 mile long, leading to houses that had names instead of numbers. My truck rumbled, the suspension squeaking slightly, as we hit a depression in the asphalt. The sound echoed off the stone walls, a stark reminder that we were invaders in this territory. Evelyn was gripping her phone so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't just checking the stock price anymore. She was checking her future. She was calculating if the inheritance she had been banking on was about to evaporate. We rounded the final curve, and the gates of Vane Manor loomed out of the darkness. They were 12 feet high, wrought iron topped with gilded spikes. A security guard stepped out of the booth. He was young, probably ex-military. He looked at the truck, then at his clipboard, then back at the truck with a frown. He didn't raise the gate. I rolled down the window. The cold air rushed in. "Delivery entrance is around the back, pal," the guard said, waving his flashlight at me. "Service road is the first left." Beside me, Evelyn made a noise that sounded like a dying animal. She slumped lower in her seat, covering her face with her hand. I looked at the guard. I didn't smile. I didn't get angry. I just looked at him with the flat, dead eyes of a man who has stared into the combustion chamber of a running jet engine. "I am not a delivery," I said. "I am the son-in-law. Open the gate." The guard paused his flashlight beam, catching the grease stain on my collar. He peered into the cab, saw Evelyn hiding behind her hand, and recognition dawned on him. But it wasn't respect. It was a different kind of dismissal. "Oh," he said, a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "Right. The mechanic. Go ahead." The gate swung open with a majestic, silent glide. I put the truck in gear and rolled forward, the tires crunching loudly on the crushed white marble of the driveway. As we approached the main house, the scale of the wealth became oppressive. The manor was a sprawling Georgian colossus lit up like a national monument. And parked in the circular driveway was a collection of automotive engineering that represented the pinnacle of luxury. There was Cornelius's vintage Rolls-Royce Phantom, gleaming in black and silver. There was a brand-new Bentley Continental likely belonging to one of the board members. And right in the center, parked aggressively close to the front steps, was a bright red Ferrari SF90 Stradale. Julian Thorne's car. Flashy, fast, and compensating for something. I pulled the Ford F-150 right up next to the Ferrari. The contrast was almost comical. My truck was covered in road salt and dust, the bumper slightly askew, the bedliner scratched and dented. It loomed over the sleek Italian sports car like a rusty mountain. "Park around the side," Evelyn whispered urgently. "Arthur, please, do not park here." I ignored her. I turned the ignition key and the engine shuddered to a halt. "This looks like a good spot," I said. Before I could open my door, the front entrance of the manor swung open. A valet in a uniform that cost more than my weekly grocery bill stepped out expecting to greet a guest. When he saw me climbing out of the truck, wearing my flannel shirt and work boots, his professional smile faltered. He looked at the truck, then at the Ferrari, then at me. "Sir," the valet said, his voice dripping with polite confusion, "the staff parking is near the garages." "I am a guest," I said, tossing him the keys. He caught them with 2 fingers, holding them as if they were contaminated with a contagious disease. "Be careful with the clutch. Second gear sticks if you don't double clutch it." Evelyn was already out of the truck, moving toward the stairs with a speed that suggested she was fleeing a crime scene. She didn't wait for me. She didn't look back. She walked past the valet, head down, rushing toward the golden light of the doorway, where her parents were waiting to dissect her life. I stood there for a moment in the driveway, the cold wind biting through my flannel shirt. I looked at the house. It looked solid, impenetrable, a fortress of old money and power. But I knew better. I knew about the cracks in the foundation. I knew about the fatigue in the metal. I knew about the rot in the core. The valet was still holding my keys, looking at the truck with disdain. "Leave it there," I told him. "I want it close. I have a feeling I will be leaving in a hurry." I walked up the stone steps, my heavy boots thudding against the granite. The door opened before I reached it, revealing the grand foyer. I could hear the clinking of crystal and the murmur of polite predatory conversation. I took a deep breath, smelling the scent of expensive lilies and old ambition. I was walking into the lion's den armed with nothing but a wrench in my soul and $15 billion in my pocket. And for the first time in 18 years, I wasn't afraid of being eaten. I was just wondering if they would choke on me. The transition from the foyer to the main drawing room of Vane Manor was designed to intimidate. One moment you were standing on cold marble, and the next you were sinking into a Persian rug that was thick enough to silence a falling body. The room was vast, lined with books that had never been read, and portraits of ancestors who looked down with consistent disapproval. The air smelled of aged leather, expensive scotch, and the distinct metallic tang of desperate ambition. I stepped across the threshold and the conversation died instantly. It was a physical sensation, like walking into a wall of pressurized air. Cornelius Vane sat in his high-backed wing chair by the fireplace, the flames casting long dancing shadows across his face. He was 75 years old, and gravity was finally winning the war against his vanity. His skin was loose around the jaw, and his eyes, once sharp and predatory, now had the milky, watery look of a man whose liver was processing too many years of 3 martini lunches. Yet he still held himself like a monarch. Surrounding him were 3 members of the board, men in gray suits, who looked like photocopies of each other, and standing right beside his chair, hand resting casually on the leather, was Julian Thorne. Julian was a specimen of modern finance, 38 years old, tanned in November, with teeth so white they looked radioactive. He wore a suit that was cut a little too slim, signaling he was not just rich but trendy. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand and was leaning in to whisper something to Cornelius, likely a joke about the poor, before I interrupted them. "Maxwell," Cornelius said. He did not stand up. He did not smile. He did not even shift his weight. He used my middle name, a habit he had developed years ago, because he claimed Arthur sounded too much like a servant's name. You made it. We were beginning to think the truck had finally given up the ghost. The truck runs fine, Cornelius, I said, walking toward them. I extended my hand. It was a gesture of basic civility, a test. Cornelius looked at my hand. He looked at the calluses, the permanent dark lines of oil ingrained in the fingerprints, the rough texture of a life spent building things. Then he looked at his own hand, manicured and soft, holding his glass of scotch. He did not move. He simply took a sip of his drink, letting my hand hang in the air for 3 agonizing seconds. "Find a seat, Maxwell," he said, dismissing the gesture, as if I had tried to sell him a used carpet. "We are discussing serious business. Try to keep up." I lowered my hand slowly. I did not feel shame. I felt a clinical fascination. I was observing a social dominance display common in primates, specifically the alpha male attempting to reinforce hierarchy when threatened by a younger, albeit in this case, different species of rival. A server appeared at my elbow. It was not the usual butler, but a younger man I did not recognize. On the silver tray next to the decanter of 50-year-old single malt scotch that the others were drinking sat a single can of domestic beer. It was not even cold. Condensation had already pooled at the bottom, suggesting it had been sitting out for a while. "Mr. Vane thought you might prefer something more to your taste," the server murmured, avoiding my eyes. I looked at the can. It was a masterstroke of passive-aggressive hospitality. In a room where the scotch cost $400 a bottle, serving a man a $2 beer was not a drink, it was an insult. It was a way of saying, "You do not have the palate for our world. You belong to the gas station, not the country club." I took the can. I did not open it. I just held it, feeling the lukewarm aluminum. "Thoughtful," I said. "So, Arthur," Julian Thorne spoke up. His voice was smooth practice, the kind of voice that sold subprime mortgages to pensioners and called it a diversified investment strategy. He turned his body fully toward me, blocking out the firelight, casting himself as the golden boy. "Evelyn tells me you have been busy. How is what is it?" "The repair business." "Restoration," I corrected him calmly. "Right. Restoration." He chuckled, a sound that was echoed by the gray suits on the couch. "I have a landscaping crew at my estate in the Hamptons. They are always complaining about their equipment. Maybe I should send them your way. Do you do bulk rates on lawnmowers?" The room went silent. They were waiting for me to blush. They were waiting for me to stammer a defense about how I worked on vintage Jaguars and Triumphs, not lawnmowers. They wanted me to validate their hierarchy by pleading for respect. Instead, I looked at Julian. I analyzed his posture. He was leaning forward on the balls of his feet, aggressive, eager. But his left eye had a micro-tic, a tiny spasm in the lower lid. Stress. High cortisol levels. He was leveraged. He was terrified. He needed this merger with Vane Aerospace to save his own fund, and he was projecting his insecurity onto the easiest target in the room. The internal combustion principle of a 4-stroke lawnmower engine is remarkably similar to the auxiliary power unit of a commercial airliner. I said, my voice steady and low. It is all about the stoichiometric ratio. If you fail to regulate the air-fuel mixture at 14.7 to 1, you get incomplete combustion. In a lawnmower, you get smoke. In the high-bypass turbofans that Vane Aerospace is currently having trouble with, you get thermal runaway and catastrophic turbine blade separation due to localized hot spots exceeding the melting point of the nickel superalloy. I took a sip of the warm beer. So to answer your question, Julian, no, I do not fix lawnmowers. But if your hedge fund crashes because you invested in an engine with a fatal flow dynamics flaw, I might be able to explain the math to you. Silence stretched across the room again, but this time it was different. It was confused. Julian blinked. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second as his brain tried to parse the technical jargon. He looked at Cornelius, then back at me and decided to laugh. It was a loud, forced bark of a laugh. "Listen to him," Julian crowed, slapping his thigh. "Thermal runaway stoichiometric ratio. He sounds like he swallowed a dictionary. You have quite an imagination, Arthur. Maybe you should write science fiction instead of changing spark plugs." Cornelius joined in a dry, wheezing chuckle. "He likes to use big words, Julian. It makes him feel involved. Ignore him." They dismissed it. They dismissed the specific, highly classified technical details I had just handed them on a platter. To them it was just the rambling of a mechanic trying to sound smart. They were so blinded by my flannel shirt that they could not hear the warning sirens screaming in their faces. I felt a movement to my left. It was Evelyn. She had been standing near the entrance watching the exchange. In the past, this was the moment she would have stepped in. She would have linked her arm in mine, made a joke to diffuse the tension, and pulled me into the circle. She would have been the bridge between her world and mine. But tonight the bridge collapsed. Evelyn walked past me. She did not look at me. She did not touch my arm. She walked straight to the fireplace, past the gray suits, past Julian, and stood behind her father's chair. She placed a hand on Cornelius's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. "Daddy, your glass is empty," she said softly. "Let me refill it." The visual symbolism was devastatingly clear. She had physically and symbolically crossed the room. She was standing on the other side of the divide now. On one side, the Vane dynasty Cornelius in his throne, Julian the heir apparent, and Evelyn, the loyal daughter. On the other side, Arthur the mechanic, holding a warm can of cheap beer, standing alone on the edge of the carpet. "Thank you, darling," Cornelius said, patting her hand. He looked up at me with a gaze that was pure distilled triumph. He had won. He had reclaimed his daughter. I was just a vestigial limb waiting to be amputated. "Dinner is served," the butler announced from the doorway, breaking the tableau. "Excellent," Julian said, clapping his hands together. "I am starving. I hear the chef prepared the Wagyu. Arthur, have you ever had Wagyu? It is a bit different from Hamburger Helper." "I will manage," I said. They began to move toward the dining room, a phalanx of wealth and arrogance. Evelyn walked between Cornelius and Julian, laughing at something Julian whispered in her ear. It was a high, brittle laugh, the sound of glass breaking. I stayed behind for a moment. I looked at the can of beer in my hand. I walked over to the fireplace where a Ming vase worth $40,000 sat on the mantel. I set the empty can down right next to it, the condensation leaving a ring of water on the antique wood. "Thermal runaway," I whispered to the empty room. "It starts small. Just a little extra heat. Just a little friction. And then before you know it, the whole structure melts down." I followed them into the dining room. They thought I was walking to my execution. They did not realize I was the one who had designed the guillotine. The isolation they had forced upon me was not a punishment, it was a vantage point. From the outside, you can see the cracks that the people on the inside are too close to notice. And tonight, I was going to stick a crowbar into the biggest crack I could find and pry it open until the whole house came down. The dining room of Vane Manor was a study in architectural intimidation. The table was a solid slab of mahogany long enough to land a Cessna on polish to a mirror shine that reflected the crystal chandelier overhead. There were 12 seats, but only 6 were set. Cornelius sat at the head, of course, framed by the velvet curtains, like a king in a bad historical drama. To his right sat Beatrice, my mother-in-law, a woman whose face had been pulled so tight by plastic surgery that her eyebrows seemed permanently surprised by her own existence. Next to her was Julian Thorne, radiating smugness like a radioactive isotope. Across from them sat Evelyn, her eyes fixed on her plate as if counting the molecules in her salad. And then there was me. I was not seated next to my wife. I was not even seated in the middle. I had been placed at the absolute far end of the table, a full 10 feet of empty mahogany separating me from the rest of the group. My chair was positioned precariously close to the swinging door of the kitchen. Every time the staff entered with a new course, a gust of warm air smelling of rosemary and exhaust fans hit the back of my neck. It was a classic power play. Isolation, exile. They had physically removed me from the conversation before the first word was even spoken. "So," Cornelius began, his voice booming down the length of the table. He did not look at me. He addressed the group as if I were a piece of furniture that had unfortunately been left in the room. "The Pentagon briefing is next Tuesday. We are locked in." "That is incredible, Cornelius," Julian said, leaning forward, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. $30 billion. That will make Vane Aerospace the largest defense contractor on the eastern seaboard. "It is not just about the money, Julian," Cornelius said, waving a hand dismissively, though his eyes glittered with greed. "It is about legacy. The VX-10 program is revolutionary. We are talking about a fighter jet engine that can sustain Mach 3 without afterburners. The key is the cooling system. We have developed a proprietary graphene mesh heat exchange technology that no one else has. It is the holy grail of thermodynamics." I chewed my bread slowly. The bread was dry. Graphene mesh heat exchange. I repeated, my voice low but carrying clearly across the empty expanse of the table. Cornelius stopped. The fork in his hand froze. He looked down the long tunnel of mahogany at me, squinting as if trying to focus on a distant insect. "Excuse me. You said you developed a proprietary graphene mesh heat exchange technology," I said. I picked up my water glass. "That is interesting, because graphene is notoriously difficult to integrate into nickel alloy turbines. The thermal expansion coefficients are incompatible, unless of course you use a laser sintering bonding process." The table went quiet. Julian laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "Laser sintering?" Listen to him. He probably read that in a popular mechanics magazine in the waiting room of his dentist. "Actually," I continued, ignoring Julian, "the bonding process is crucial. If you don't get the porosity right, the graphene delaminates at 1,200 degrees. And if that happens, your $30 billion engine turns into a $30 billion grenade." Cornelius's face turned a shade of red that matched the bordello-style curtains. "We own the patent, Maxwell. We have the best engineers in the world. I don't need a lecture on materials science from a man who spends his days welding rusted mufflers." "You own the patent?" I asked. "Are you sure about that, Cornelius? Because I recall reading the filing. The patent for laser-sintered graphene matrix for high-temperature applications is held by a holding company called, what was it? Aegis Dynamics. Aegis is a subsidiary," Cornelius snapped. "We bought them out 2 years ago." "Did you," I asked, "or did you buy a shell company that leased the technology from Aegis? Because if Aegis decides to pull the license, your proprietary technology evaporates." Cornelius slammed his hand on the table. The crystal glasses jumped. "Enough, I will not have my business acumen questioned at my own table by a grease monkey. You are here out of charity, Maxwell. Remember that." Beatrice chimed in. Then her voice, a high, reedy sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. She turned to Evelyn, completely ignoring the fact that I had just exposed a potentially catastrophic flaw in their business plan. "Evelyn, darling," Beatrice said, gesturing with a diamond-encrusted hand toward Julian. "Have you seen Julian's new townhouse in Manhattan? It is on Park Avenue. 3 floors, a private elevator. It is suitable for someone of our station." Evelyn didn't look up. She pushed a piece of asparagus around her plate. "That sounds nice, Mother." "Nice? It is magnificent," Beatrice insisted. She turned her gaze on me, her eyes cold and hard like polished stones. "Unlike that apartment you lived in when you first married Arthur. Do you remember that, Evelyn? The smell of cabbage in the hallway. The sirens all night I cried for a week when I visited you there. a vain, living like a refugee. It was a loft in Brooklyn, I said, and it had good light. It was a slum, Beatrice hissed, and look at you now, dragging our daughter down. Look at Julian. He is 38. He runs a fund. He builds things. He creates value. What do you create? Arthur, besides debt and embarrassment. I create things that work, I said. I fix things that are broken. You are a weight, Beatrice said, the venom in her voice undisguised now. A heavy, useless weight around Evelyn's neck. She could be the First Lady of New York society. She could be hosting galas. Instead, she is explaining away your truck to the neighbors. She is apologizing for your absence at the opera because you are too busy playing in your garage. You are holding her back, Arthur. You are stealing her life. I looked at Evelyn. This was the moment. This was the moment where in any other timeline, in any other marriage, the wife would slam her hand on the table. She would defend the man she chose. She would tell her mother that money didn't matter, that character mattered, that the years we spent in that Brooklyn loft were the happiest of her life. I waited. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Evelyn lifted her wineglass. She took a long swallow. She set the glass down. She did not look at me. She did not look at her mother. She looked at Julian. Tell me about the townhouse, Julian, Evelyn said softly. Does it have a view of the park? The breath left my lungs. It wasn't a physical blow, but it felt like one. It was a rejection so absolute, so casual, that it hurt more than if she had screamed at me. She hadn't just failed to defend me, she had actively chosen to pivot away to step over my body and continue the conversation with the man they wanted her to be with. She had signaled to everyone at the table that I was no longer a person to her. I was just an obstacle she was tired of climbing over. Julian beamed, sensing the victory. The view is spectacular, Evelyn. From the master bedroom, you can see the entire skyline. I was actually thinking, maybe you could help me with the interior design. It needs a woman's touch. A refined touch. I would love to, Evelyn said. Cornelius smiled. It was a shark smile. He picked up his knife and cut into his steak with renewed vigor. The tension in the room broke, replaced by a conspiratorial warmth that excluded only me. They began to talk about galas, about summer houses in the Hamptons, about which senators they owned. They laughed. They toasted. I sat at the end of the table 10 feet away in the draft of the kitchen door. I looked at the three of them. Cornelius, the fraudulent king, Beatrice, the cruel queen, and Julian, the hollow prince, and Evelyn, the princess who had sold her soul to buy back her crown. They thought they had won. They thought they had shamed me into silence. They thought the discussion about the graphene patent was over because the mechanic had been put in his place. But they didn't know that Aegis Dynamics, the company that held the actual patent for the cooling system, Cornelius was betting his $30 billion contract on, I owned it. I had bought Aegis 5 years ago when it was failing. I had poured capital into the R&D. I had personally guided the engineering team to solve the bonding issue Cornelius had dismissed. The technology was real. It was revolutionary. And it belonged to me. Vane Aerospace was using it under a temporary licensing agreement that expired. I checked my mental calendar. In exactly 48 hours. If I didn't renew that license, their engines were illegal. Their contract was void. Their stock was worthless. I watched Cornelius chew his steak oblivious. I watched Beatrice preen. I watched Julian flirt with my wife. And I watched Evelyn smile back at him, a smile that erased 18 years of marriage. I picked up my fork. I wasn't hungry, but I needed to eat. I needed the energy. Because the main course was over, and dessert was going to be very, very bitter. The servers cleared the main course with the silent efficiency of funeral directors removing a body. The clinking of silverware against fine china ceased, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands resting on the cold mahogany. I had not finished my steak. The appetite I thought I had was gone, replaced by a hard, cold knot in my stomach. I watched the staff retreat into the kitchen, the swinging door settling into stillness. We were alone. The Vane family, the interloper, Julian Thorne, and me. Cornelius did not signal for dessert. Instead, he made a small, sharp motion with his left hand, a gesture I had seen him use a dozen times in board meetings when he was about to initiate a hostile takeover. From the shadows of the hallway, a man stepped forward. I recognized him immediately. It was Archibald Sterling, the family's personal attorney. He was a man who looked like he had been born in a three-piece suit, his soul as gray and pressed as his trousers. He did not look at me. He walked straight to the table, gliding over the Persian rug, and placed a leather legal folder directly in front of me. The folder was blue. Not a bright, cheerful blue, but the dark, heavy navy of officialdom. It landed on the wood with a soft slap that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room. "What is this?" I asked. My voice was steady, but my heart rate had dropped. I was entering a state of physiological combat readiness. My body was diverting blood flow from digestion to muscles preparing for a threat. "Read it," Cornelius said. He leaned back in his chair, linking his fingers over his stomach. "It is a standard separation agreement. Irrevocable. Binding." I opened the folder. The paper inside was thick, high-quality bond, the kind that cost $2 a sheet. The header was embossed. Vane Sterling Associates. I scanned the legal jargon, my eyes picking out the key phrases with the speed of a man used to reading technical schematics. Dissolution of marriage, waiver of spousal support, non-disclosure agreement, immediate vacating of the premises. And then I saw the number. It was printed in bold text in the center of the second page. $500,000. I stared at the words. $500,000. To a man who changed oil for a living, it was a fortune. It was a winning lottery ticket. It was freedom. To me, it was a rounding error. It was less than the interest my portfolio earned in a single week. It was an insult so profound it almost made me laugh. "This is a buyout," I said, looking up. I directed my gaze at Cornelius. "You are buying me out of my marriage like I am a bad investment in a subsidiary company." "We are offering you a fresh start, Maxwell," Cornelius said. His tone was not hostile. It was patronizing, the way one speaks to a slow child. "Let us be honest. This marriage has run its course. You are unhappy. Evelyn is burdened. We want to help you move on. $500,000 is a lot of money for a man in your position. You could buy a garage. You could move to Florida. You could finally buy a new truck." "And the condition?" I asked. "Clause 4, Section B?" "You leave Connecticut," Julian Thorne interjected, unable to help himself. He was swirling his brandy, looking at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Permanently. We do not want you popping up at the club or lingering. It is cleaner that way." "Cleaner," I repeated, like scrubbing a stain out of a carpet. I turned my head to look at Evelyn. She had not moved. She was staring at the centerpiece, a complex arrangement of white orchids. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. "Evelyn," I said, "is this what you want? You want to pay me to disappear?" She did not answer immediately. She reached for her wineglass, her hand trembling slightly, the only sign that there was a human being inside that designer dress. "It is complicated, Arthur," she whispered. "It is not complicated at all," Cornelius boomed. "Tell him Evelyn. Tell him the rest. He needs to understand the stakes." Evelyn closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, the trembling had stopped. The steel had returned. She turned to face me, and for the first time that night I saw the woman I had married completely vanish. In her place sat a stranger wearing her face. "I am pregnant, Arthur," she said. The words hung in the air, suspended in the cold light of the chandelier. I felt a physical jolt in my chest, as if a turbine blade had just shattered inside my ribcage. We had not been intimate in 4 months. The timeline was mathematically improbable. Unless, it is early. Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength, becoming colder, harder. 8 weeks. But it changes everything. This child is the future of the Vane family. It is an heir. And we cannot have any confusion about its lineage. We cannot have any complications. Complications, I said. The word tasted like ash. You mean me. I am the complication. Look at yourself, Arthur. Beatrice sneered from across the table. You are 64 years old. You are a laborer. Do you really think you are fit to be a father to a child who will inherit an aerospace empire? Do you think we want our grandchild raised in a garage smelling of gasoline and failure? We need to protect this child's future. We need to ensure it is raised with the proper influences. She glanced at Julian. He smiled a modest, humble smile that made me want to reach across the table and dismantle his jaw structure. The implication was clear. Whether the child was biologically mine or Julian's was almost irrelevant to them. They intended to erase me. They intended to rewrite the narrative so that this child would be born into a world where Julian Thorne was the father figure, where the Vane name was untainted by the blood of a mechanic. You want to scrub my name, I said. You want to pay me $500,000 to pretend I never existed, to abandon a child that might be mine. It is for the best, Cornelia said. For everyone, especially the child. Think about it, Maxwell. What can you offer a baby? You have no status, no connections, no ambition. You would only be a hindrance. Julian here. Julian can offer the world. I looked at the check attached to the document. It was a cashier's check already printed. $500,000. The price of my dignity. The price of my paternity. The price of 18 years of my life. I looked at Evelyn one last time. I needed to hear it from her. I needed to know that there was absolutely nothing left of the woman who had once stood in the rain and told me she loved me for my simplicity. Evelyn, I said softly, you are asking me to sell our marriage. You are asking me to sell my rights to my own child. Is that who you are now? She looked me in the eye. Her gaze was dry, clear, and utterly devastating. Take the money, Arthur, she said. Her voice was not angry. It was tired. Be realistic. You are old. You do not fit in this world. You never did. I tried to make it work, but I was young and stupid. I thought love was enough. But love does not pay the bills. Love does not secure a legacy. Julian. Julian is what I need. He is what this family needs. This is the last mercy I can offer you. Take the check. Go somewhere warm. Be happy with your machines. Just go. Something inside me broke. It was not a loud break. It was not a scream or a sob. It was the sound of a structural support finally giving way under immense pressure. It was the silent, catastrophic failure of a critical component. For 18 years, I had held on to the belief that Evelyn was a victim of her family, that underneath the layers of conditioning, she was still the free spirit I had met. I had hidden my wealth to protect that spirit, to prove that we didn't need their money to be happy. I had been wrong. The woman sitting across from me was not a victim. She was a co-conspirator. She was not trapped. She was exactly where she wanted to be. She had looked at my hands, my work, my life, and she had valued it at exactly $500,000. The love I had guarded so fiercely evaporated. It didn't turn into hate. Hate is a hot emotion. It requires energy. This was something else. This was absolute zero. This was the cold, unyielding clarity of a mathematical equation that has finally been balanced. I was no longer a husband. I was no longer a son-in-law. I was a foreign object in a hostile organism, and the organism was trying to expel me. But they had forgotten one thing. You do not expel a foreign object that is harder than the organism itself. You break your teeth on it. I reached out and picked up the pen that lay on top of the folder. It was a Mont Blanc, heavy and expensive. I turned it over in my grease-stained fingers. "You are right, Evelyn," I said. My voice was different now. The gravel was gone, replaced by the smooth, precise cadence of a man who lectures on advanced propulsion theory. I do not fit in this world. I never did. Because this world is small. It is petty. And it is built on a foundation of lies. I looked at the check again. 500,000. "You think this is mercy?" I asked, looking up at Cornelius. "You think this is power?" I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't sign the paper. I didn't tear it up. I simply closed the folder and placed my hand on top of it, claiming the space, claiming the moment. The time for masquerades was over. The mechanic had just left the building. The engineer had arrived, and the engineer had a very different plan for restructuring this company. "I will not take your money," I said, "but I will take something else." "Don't be a fool, Maxwell," Cornelius growled, sensing the shift in my demeanor, but not understanding it. "This is a one-time offer. If you walk out of here without signing, you get nothing. We will bury you in court. We will ruin you." "Ruin me," I repeated. A small cold smile touched my lips. "That is an interesting concept, Cornelius. But before you bury me, there is something you need to check. Something about the structural integrity of your own position." I pushed my chair back. The sound of wood scraping against wood was loud in the silent room. I stood up. I was not slouching anymore. I stood to my full height of 6 feet 2 inches. I unbuttoned the cuffs of my flannel shirt and rolled them up, slowly revealing the forearms that they thought were just strong from turning wrenches. "You missed a step in your due diligence, Mr. Sterling," I said to the lawyer, who frowned. "You checked my bank account. You checked my credit score. You checked the title on my truck. But you never asked the most important question in any engineering failure analysis." "And what is that?" Julian sneered. "You never asked what is holding the whole thing up," I said. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat. It was time. I did not reach for the Mont Blanc pen. I did not reach for the check that promised to buy my disappearance for $500,000. Instead, I reached for the linen napkin that rested on my lap. I unfolded it with slow, deliberate movements, smoothing out the creases against the edge of the mahogany table. I dabbed the corners of my mouth, folded the napkin into a perfect square, and placed it gently next to the blue folder. The silence in the room was brittle, a thin sheet of glass waiting to be shattered. They were all watching me, Cornelius, with his arrogant expectation of obedience, Beatrice, with her disdain, Julian with his smug victory, and Evelyn with a mixture of shame and relief. They expected the mechanic to take the money. They expected the beaten dog to take the bone and limp away. But the man sitting in the chair was no longer the mechanic. I looked up, and for the first time in 18 years, I dropped the veil. I let the fatigue fall away from my eyes. I let the submissive slump of my shoulders correct itself. I looked at Cornelius Vane, not as a father-in-law, but as a problem in structural engineering that required a catastrophic stress test. "Let us talk about fatigue," I said. My voice was different. The gravelly rasp of the garage was gone. In its place was the cool, resonant baritone of a man who had spent 40 years commanding boardrooms and lecture halls. It was a voice that did not ask for permission to speak. It granted permission to listen. Cornelius frowned, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me. I told you, Maxwell, this is not a negotiation. Sign the papers." "I am not talking about emotional fatigue, Cornelius." I continued, ignoring his command, as if he were a background noise in a factory floor. "I am talking about metal fatigue. Specifically, the low cycle fatigue limits of the titanium aluminide alloy you are using in the compressor stage of the VX-10 prototype." The room went dead still. It was the kind of silence you hear in a cockpit when the engines flame out. Julian Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh. Oh, here we go again. The mechanic has been reading Wikipedia. Arthur, please. You are embarrassing yourself. I turned my head slowly to look at Julian. I did not blink. I dissected him with my eyes, the nervous tick in his left eyelid, the sweat beginning to bead at his hairline, the cheap arrogance that masked a terrified amateur. Shut up, Julian, I said. I did not shout. I said it with the casual authority one uses to silence a barking dog. Julian's mouth snapped shut. The shock on his face was genuine. He had never heard me speak like that. None of them had. I turned back to Cornelius. He was staring at me, his face a mask of confusion and rising anger. You are betting the entire future of Vane Aerospace on the VX-10 contract, I said, leaning forward slightly, clasping my grease-stained hands on the table. $30 billion. It relies on the engine achieving a thrust-to-weight ratio of 12-to-1. To do that, you increase the turbine inlet temperature to 2,000 degrees Celsius. Cornelius shifted in his chair. That is proprietary information. How do you— But there is a problem, I interrupted, my voice cutting through his bluster like a laser cutter through steel. You switched suppliers for the turbine blades 3 months ago. You moved from a supplier in Ohio to a cheaper vendor in Malaysia to save 4% on the unit cost. You thought nobody would notice. You thought the specs were identical. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. Do you know what happens to a polycrystalline nickel superalloy when it is subjected to high-frequency vibration at 2,000 degrees Celsius? Cornelius, I asked, do you understand the physics of grain boundary sliding? Cornelius opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at his board members. They were staring at me, their faces pale. They knew exactly what I was talking about, but they were terrified that I knew what I was talking about. It does not bend, I said softly. It does not stretch. It undergoes catastrophic intergranular fracture. It shatters. Like glass. I picked up the heavy crystal water glass in front of me. I held it up to the light. 3 days ago, I said, in your test facility in the Mojave Desert, engine number 4 exploded on the test stand. The turbine blades disintegrated at 92% operational speed. The shrapnel tore through the containment casing and destroyed $2 million of monitoring equipment. You buried the report. You classified it as a sensor anomaly to keep the Pentagon from finding out before the contract signing next Tuesday. Cornelius's face went white. It was not the pale of fear, it was the gray of a man watching a ghost rise from the grave. He gripped the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles turned yellow. Who told you that? He whispered. That is classified data. That is impossible. You are a mechanic. You fix pickup trucks. I fix mistakes, I corrected him. And you, Cornelius, are making a very expensive mistake. You are trying to sell a defective engine to the United States Air Force. That is not just negligence. That is treason. And when those engines fail, and they will fail, the pilots inside those jets will not care about your quarterly earnings. They will care about the physics you ignored. This is insane, Beatrice hissed, though her voice wavered. He is making this up. He is trying to scare us. Cornelius, call security. Get him out of here. I am not finished, I said. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Cornelius, pinning him to his chair with the weight of the truth. The engineering is bad, I said, but the financials are worse. I shifted my gaze to Julian Thorne. The young hedge fund manager was no longer smiling. He was gripping his brandy snifter with both hands, looking like a man who realizes the lifeboat he just jumped into has a hole in the bottom. You, I said, pointing a finger at him. A finger with a scar running down the knuckle. A scar I got from a lathe accident when I was 22. You are the genius behind the merger. The financial wizard who is going to take Vane Aerospace public again and make everyone rich. I am advising, Julian stammered. My firm. We specialize in distress turnarounds. Distress, I repeated. That is an interesting word. Let us talk about your firm, Julian. Thorn Capital Partners. You posted a return of 22% last year. Impressive. Almost miraculous in this market. I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest. The flannel shirt pulled tight across my shoulders. But you have a problem with your EBITDA calculations, don't you? I asked. Julian swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. I do not know what you are talking about. Our books are audited. Audited by a firm you own through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, I said. I looked at your Q3 filings, Julian. Specifically the line item for capitalized software development costs. I saw the recognition in his eyes. The sheer, unadulterated panic. He knew that I knew. You took $42,381,000 of operating expenses, salaries, rent, server costs, and you reclassified them as capital expenditures, I said. I spoke the numbers, slowly enunciating every syllable. 42 million. That artificially inflated your net income. It made a company that was losing $12 million look like it made $30 million. That is not accounting, Julian. That is fraud. That is Sarbanes-Oxley violations. That is 15 years in federal prison. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen 50 feet away. Evelyn was staring at me with her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide. She looked at Julian, waiting for him to laugh, to deny it, to crush me with his superior intellect. But Julian said nothing. He couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating. And here is the best part. I continued, enjoying the dissection. You are using the Vane Aerospace merger to cover your losses. You need Cornelius's cash reserves to plug the $42 million hole in your balance sheet before your investors find out. You are not here to save this family, Julian. You are here to loot it. I turned back to Cornelius. He is a parasite, Cornelius. And you invited him to dinner. You offered him your daughter. You offered him your legacy. Because you were too arrogant to check the math. Lies, Julian finally shouted, jumping to his feet. His chair fell backward with a crash. This is slander. I will sue you. I will take everything you have. You are a nobody. You are a dirty, greasy mechanic who lives in a shed. How dare you speak to me about finance? Sit down, boy, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I just injected a note of command so absolute that Julian actually froze. I am not speaking to you about finance. I am speaking to you about arithmetic. It is simple addition and subtraction. And right now, you are a negative number. Cornelius slammed his hand on the table. The sound was like a gunshot. Enough! He stood up, shaking with rage. His face was a mottled purple. The vein in his temple was throbbing dangerously. I do not know who you think you are, Cornelius roared, spitting the words out. I do not know where you stole this information. Maybe you broke into my office. Maybe you paid off a secretary. It doesn't matter. You are a criminal. You are a spy. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. You come into my house, you eat my food, and you dare to threaten me. You dare to lecture me on my company. I built Vane Aerospace from nothing. I am the industry. And you are nothing. You are a footnote. You are the mistake my daughter made when she was 25. Cornelius. Beatrice tried to soothe him, reaching for his arm, but he shook her off. Get out! Cornelius screamed. Get out of my house. Take your $500,000 and get out, or I will have the police here in 10 minutes to arrest you for corporate espionage. I will ruin you, Maxwell. I will make sure you never work in this state again. I will crush you like a bug. I sat there calm amidst the storm. I watched his rage. It was the rage of a man who knows he is cornered but refuses to admit it. It was the rage of a king who realizes his castle is built on sand. You ask who I am, I said quietly, my voice cutting through his shouting. I stood up slowly. I did not rush. I picked up the blue folder with the check inside. I looked at it for a moment, then tossed it into the center of the table. It landed on top of the untouched roast beef. You think I am Arthur the mechanic? I said. You think I am the man who needs your $500,000 to survive. You think I am the man who fixes your lawnmowers and drives a rusted truck. I reached into my pocket, not for a wrench. Not for a rag. You asked for a divorce, I said, looking at Evelyn. She was trembling now, tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing. The connection was severed. You asked for a clean break. You asked to protect the Vane legacy from the stain of my name. I pulled out the secure satellite phone. I placed it on the table. The screen glowed with a green light displaying a single secure connection status. You should be careful what you ask for, Cornelius, I said, because the Vane legacy is not what you think it is, and the man standing in front of you is not who you think he is. Who are you? Cornelius demanded, his voice dropping to a rasp. The fear was overtaking the anger now. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere. He could feel the predator in the room, and he finally realized it wasn't him. I am the reason you still have a company, I said. I am the reason the bank didn't foreclose on this house in 2008. I am the reason you made payroll last month. I looked at Julian. And I am the investor you have been trying to schedule a meeting with for 3 years. The one who refused to take your calls. Julian's eyes went wide. His mouth fell open. The anonymous investor. The Black Hawk Fund. Hello, Julian, I said. I read your prospectus. It was poorly written. I turned back to Cornelius. You wanted to know about the metal fatigue in the VX-10, I said. You wanted to know why I know about the grain boundaries and the thermal limits. I leaned in close, so close I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. I know because I designed the alloy, Cornelius. I hold the patent. And as of this morning, I am recalling the license, which means every engine you built in the last 6 months is now illegal to sell. The color drained from his face so completely he looked like a corpse. You, he whispered. You are. I am the man who owns you, I said. The room spun into a vortex of shock. But I wasn't done. The technical counterattack was just the opening salvo. The real weapon was about to be deployed. I reached for the phone. It was time to make the call that would turn their world into dust. The device in my hand was not the cracked, grease-stained flip phone I used to order auto parts. It was a matte black satellite communicator encrusted in a shock-proof polymer casing with no brand name and no camera. It was a piece of hardware issued only to individuals who required encrypted communication channels that bypassed local cellular networks. It looked like a weapon on the polished mahogany table, an alien object sitting among the fine china and crystal stemware. I pressed the single biometric scanner on the side. The screen flared to life, not with a colorful home screen, but with a stark amber command prompt. Cornelius blinked, his rage momentarily paused by confusion. He squinted at the device. It looked military. It looked serious. It did not look like something a mechanic picked up at a discount electronics store. What is that? Julian asked, his voice trembling slightly. Who are you calling the police? Go ahead. Call them. I will have you arrested for trespassing before you can... I ignored him. I held the device to my ear. The connection was instantaneous, routed through a low-orbit satellite constellation I had helped fund 10 years ago. Command, I said. My voice was devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a pilot reading a checklist before an airstrike. Identify user Penhaligon 0. Voice print authentication confirmed. The room fell into a stunned silence. They watched me paralyzed by the sudden shift in reality. Execute Omega Protocol, I said. Target entity Vane Aerospace. Secondary target Thorn Capital Partners. Authorization code Alpha 9, Victor Zulu 4. I lowered the phone and placed it gently on the table. The screen pulsed once, a slow, rhythmic heartbeat of amber light, and then went dark. What did you do? Evelyn whispered. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Arthur, who were you talking to? Wait for it, I said softly. 3 seconds passed. Then the sound began. It started with Julian's phone. It was sitting on the table next to his brandy snifter. It vibrated violently against the wood, a harsh drilling sound. Then the screen lit up with a notification. Then another. Then a cascade of them, lighting up the room like a strobe light. Buzz, 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 buzz. Then Cornelius's phone tucked in his jacket pocket began to ring. It was his private line, the number only his broker and the board members knew. Then the phones of the 3 board members sitting on the couch simultaneously erupted in a cacophony of chimes, ringtones, and vibration alerts. The room was suddenly filled with the electronic panic of the 21st century. It was the sound of a digital avalanche. Julian grabbed his phone first. He unlocked it with a frantic swipe. I watched his face. The tan drained away instantly, leaving his skin a sickly ash-gray color. His eyes widened until I thought they might tear at the corners. "Oh my God," Julian gasped. "Oh my God. The market. It is crashing. No, it is not the market. It is us." "What is it?" Cornelius demanded, fumbling to pull his own phone out of his pocket. "What is happening?" "Trading halt," one of the board members shouted, looking at his screen in horror. "The SEC just halted trading on Vane Aerospace. Ticker symbol VAE. Reason pending material disclosure." "Material disclosure," Cornelius roared. "We did not issue a disclosure." "Look at the volume," Julian screamed. He held up his phone, showing a graph that looked like a cliff face. Someone just dumped 40 million shares in a block trade. 40 million. It triggered a circuit breaker. The stock is down 35% in 12 seconds. 40 million shares. Cornelius stared at him, his hands shaking. "That is impossible. No one holds that kind of volume outside of... He stopped. The realization hit him like a physical blow. "Outside of the Black Hawk Fund?" I finished the sentence for him. I stood up. I pushed my chair back and began to walk. I did not walk toward the door. I walked toward the head of the table. I moved with a slow, predatory grace, my heavy boots thudding softly on the Persian rug. I walked past the empty chairs, past the cold food, past the remnants of the life they thought I lived. I stopped directly behind Cornelius's chair. He was seated frozen, staring at his phone where the red numbers were hemorrhaging value. I loomed over him, a shadow casting darkness over his panic. "You have spent 20 years wondering who they were," I said. My voice was calm, conversational, contrasting sharply with the chaos on their screens. "The mysterious Black Hawk Fund, the angel investor, the entity that always seemed to appear exactly when you were about to default on your loans." I reached out and picked up Cornelius's wine glass. I took a sip. It was an excellent vintage, far superior to the warm beer they had served me. "In 2008, I said, "when the credit markets froze and you couldn't make payroll, Blackhawk injected $50 million into your operating account. You called it a miracle. You told the board that God was watching over the Vane legacy." I took another step, moving around the table toward Julian. "In 2015, I continued, when the FAA grounded your entire fleet due to the hydraulic failure in the V7 model, your stock dropped to $4 a share. Wall Street wrote you off. But then Blackhawk started buying. We bought the dip. We stabilized the price. We gave you the capital to redesign the hydraulics." I stopped in front of Julian. He was staring at his phone, watching his own net worth evaporate. "And you, Julian," I said. "Thorn Capital. You were shorting Vane Aerospace in 2019, weren't you? You were betting against the family you are now trying to marry into. But you got squeezed. A massive buy order came in and forced you to cover your position at a loss. You lost $12 million that day. You never knew who was on the other side of that trade." I leaned down, bringing my face level with his. "It was me." Julian dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a crack, but he didn't notice. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror. "You," Cornelius whispered. He twisted in his chair to look at me. You the mechanic. I am not a mechanic, Cornelius, I said. I never was. I am an engineer, and engineers understand leverage. I walked to the sideboard where a decanter of water stood. I poured myself a glass, taking my time. I started the Blackhawk Fund 27 years ago, I said, turning back to face them. I used the royalties from my first propulsion patent. I named it after the first engine I ever rebuilt. I did not buy sports cars. I did not buy mansions. I bought potential. I bought undervalued assets. And when I met Evelyn and I saw how precarious your family business actually was, I started buying Vane Aerospace. I looked at Evelyn. She was weeping silently, her hands covering her mouth. She knew. Deep down, she had always known I was more than I appeared, but she had let the world convince her otherwise. I owned 51% of the voting shares, Cornelius, I said. I did not tell you because I wanted you to succeed on your own. I wanted to support you from the shadows, to give you the safety net you needed to build something real. I thought that if I gave you security, you would eventually find your integrity. I shook my head slowly. But you didn't. You took the money and you bought bigger houses. You took the security and you became arrogant. And instead of integrity, you developed a God complex. 51%, Cornelius rasped. That is $15 billion. You have $15 billion. Give or take a few hundred million depending on the market fluctuation, I said. Although after the call I just made, it is probably significantly less at this exact moment. But I can afford the loss. Can you... The call, Julian stammered. The Omega Protocol. What is that? It is a kill switch, I explained. I just ordered Blackhawk to liquidate its entire position in Vane Aerospace. We are dumping 51% of the company onto the open market in a single block. But not just that. I also activated the covenants on the debt I hold. I pointed to the blue folder on the table. You see, I do not just own the equity. I own the debt. Through a subsidiary called Ironclad Lending, I hold the note on this house. I hold the note on the factory in Ohio. I hold the note on the corporate jet you flew to Aspen last weekend. Cornelius looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth moved, but no words came out. The Omega Protocol, I continued, is an immediate recall of all outstanding debt due to a breach of contract. The breach being the gross negligence regarding the VX-10 engine safety data and the fraudulent financial reporting by your prospective merger partner. I checked my watch, a battered Timex that I wore because it was reliable. It has been 3 minutes, I said. By now the automated systems at the bank have received the recall notice. Your corporate accounts are frozen, your credit lines are severed, and since you pledged your personal assets as collateral for the restructuring loan in 2020 alone, I approved by the way your personal accounts are also locked, Beatrice screamed. It was a short, sharp sound. She grabbed her purse and started frantically digging for her credit card as if she could run to an ATM and withdraw their fortune before the computers caught up. It is too late, Beatrice, I said. The card will be declined. The car's in the driveway. The repossession orders are already being printed. This house. Technically, it belongs to me now. I walked back to my seat at the far end of the table. I did not sit down. I stood behind the chair, gripping the back of it with my hands. My hands were clean now. The grease was just a memory. You asked me to leave, I said. You offered me $500,000 to disappear. You wanted to erase Arthur Penhaligon from the Vane history books. I looked at each of them in turn. Well, you got your wish. Arthur the mechanic is gone. He died the moment you put that check on the table. But now you have to deal with the man who took his place. I gestured to the room, to the panic, to the ringing phones that no one dared to answer. You wanted a merger, Julian. You just merged with an iceberg. You wanted a legacy, Cornelius. I just liquidated it. You can't do this, Cornelius shouted, finding his voice at last. He stood up, swaying unsteadily. You cannot destroy my company. I am Vane Aerospace. You are just a A shareholder. I am the CEO. Not anymore, I said. That was the other part of the Omega Protocol. As the majority shareholder, I have called an emergency board meeting. It is happening right now digitally, and I am casting my 51% of the votes to remove the current CEO for cause. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile. You are fired, Cornelius. Effective immediately. Security has been notified. They should be arriving at the front gate, right about now. As if on cue, blue lights flashed through the sheer curtains of the dining room window. The sound of sirens, which had been a distant wail, suddenly became very loud and very real. And Julian, I said, looking at the young man who was now weeping openly, I forwarded your creative accounting spreadsheets to the SEC and the FBI about an hour ago. I imagine those sirens are for you too. I picked up the blue folder containing the separation agreement. I tucked it under my arm. Now, I said, I believe this dinner is over. I have a company to salvage, and you have some lawyers to call, if you can afford them. The sirens outside were growing louder, a chaotic symphony of red and blue lights washing over the walls of the dining room, but inside, the silence was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb. They were all looking at me, the man they had dismissed as a grease-stained failure, waiting for the punchline of a joke they desperately hoped I was telling. But there was no joke. There was only the cold, hard mathematics of their destruction. I reached into the leather satchel I had brought with me, the one Evelyn had always complained looked like a garbage bag, and pulled out a binder. It was 3 inches thick, bound in black with no title on the cover. I weighed it in my hand for a moment. It felt heavy, not just with paper, but with 25 years of secrets. I threw it onto the table. It slid across the polished mahogany, knocking over a crystal wine glass, and came to rest directly in front of Cornelius. The wine spilled, staining the white tablecloth like blood, but no one moved to clean it up. Open it, I commanded. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. It filled the room with the density of lead. Cornelius's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the cover. He opened it. The first page was not a financial statement. It was a technical schematic, a complex, detailed drawing of a molecular lattice structure. Do you recognize that, Cornelius? I asked. He stared at the drawing, his eyes squinting. This is the Vane X composite, the thermal shielding for the new engines. It is our core intellectual property. It is, I agreed. And look at the signature at the bottom of the patent filing. Cornelius looked. He leaned in closer, his breath hitching in his chest. Arthur P. Penhaligon, he read. The name came out as a whisper, a sound of pure disbelief. Dated, 1999. I invented the polymer compound that sits at the heart of every single engine Vane Aerospace has built in the last 2 decades, I said. I walked slowly around the table, owning the space. You thought you bought the technology from a shell company in Zurich. You thought you were dealing with a nameless European consortium. You were dealing with me. I created the heat-resistant alloy in my garage while you were busy buying yachts and posing for magazine covers. I licensed it to you through blind trusts. Every time a Vane engine ignites, it is my mind that keeps it from melting. Every time you signed a contract, you were paying royalties to the man you made wait in the kitchen. I stopped behind Julian Thorne. He was slumped in his chair, looking small and broken. You asked me if I fixed lawnmowers, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. Do you remember that you thought it was funny? A witty little jab at the working class? Julian flinched as if I had struck him. He did not look up. I do not fix lawnmowers, I said. I fix mistakes. I fix incompetence. And for 25 years I've been fixing this family. I watched Cornelius drive this company toward a cliff 12 times. Bad acquisitions, lazy engineering, ego-driven decisions, and every single time I was there. The invisible hand. I used the royalties from my inventions to buy the stock you were dumping. I used my dividends to recapitalize your loans. I bought the debt you defaulted on. I bought the bonds you issued to cover your gambling losses in Vegas. I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat on the wood. The sleeves of my flannel shirt were rolled up, exposing the scars on my arms, badges of honor, in a room full of soft, unblemished skin. I bought this company share by share, I said. Day by day, year by year. I did not do it for power. I did not do it for fame. I did it because I foolishly believed that if I kept the foundation strong, the house would eventually stand on its own. I did it for Evelyn. I turned my gaze to my wife. She was staring at the black binder as if it were a bomb. Her face was stripped of all its social armor. She looked naked, terrified, and pitiful. But I was wrong, I said. You cannot fix a house when the rot is in the beams. You can only prop it up for so long before gravity takes over. How much? Cornelius whispered. He was still staring at the patent document, his world crumbling around him. How much is it worth? The patent portfolio alone is valued at $4 billion, I said. The real estate assets held by my trust, including the mortgage on this manor, are another $2 billion. And the equity position, the 51% of Vane Aerospace stock that I control? I paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. At the market close today, before I triggered the sell-off, my position was worth approximately $15 billion, I said. The number hit the room like a shockwave. $15 billion. Beatrice gasped a sound that was almost obscene in its greed. Her hand flew to her mouth. She looked at me, and for a second I saw the calculation behind her eyes. She was wondering if it was too late to switch sides. She was wondering if she could claim she had always liked me. It was disgusting. 15 billion, Julian Thorne breathed. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. He realized suddenly that he had not just insulted a mechanic. He had insulted one of the wealthiest men in America. He had tried to steal the wife of a man who could buy his entire hedge fund with the contents of his checking account. Mr. Penhaligon, Arthur, please. I didn't know. If I had known. If you had known, you would have kissed my boots, I said, cutting him off with contempt. That is the difference between us, Julian. You respect money. I respect capability. You saw a flannel shirt and assumed I was nothing. You assumed that because I work with my hands, my mind must be empty. That is why you will always be a small man, Julian. No matter how many zeros are in your bank account, you are spiritually bankrupt. Cornelius made a choking sound. He clutched his chest. His face had turned a terrifying shade of gray. The reality of the situation was physically crushing him. It wasn't just the loss of his company. It was the humiliation. The realization that the man he had looked down on for 2 decades, the man he had treated like a servant, was actually his master. He realized that every meal he had eaten, every suit he had worn, every party he had thrown, had been paid for by the mechanic. You, Cornelius wheezed, you let me play the king while you held the crown. I let you keep your dignity, I said, but you threw it away. You tried to buy me off with $500,000. You tried to erase me from my own child's life. I pointed to the blue folder with the check inside still sitting on the table. Look at it, Evelyn, I said. Look at the check. Evelyn turned her head slowly. She looked at the check. $500,000. You traded $15 billion for that, I said. You traded a man who would have burned the world down to keep you warm for a man who is currently wetting his pants because the SEC is calling his phone. You had a winning lottery ticket in your pocket for 18 years, and you threw it in the trash because it was crumpled. Evelyn looked up at me. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. Arthur, I was scared. They told me, do not blame them, I said. We are adults, Evelyn. You made a choice. You chose the appearance of wealth over the reality of it. You chose the shadow over the substance, and now you have neither. Cornelius tried to stand up. He pushed himself up from the chair, his legs shaking. I need to call the board. I need to explain. There is no board to call, I said. I dissolved the board 5 minutes ago. The new directors are being appointed as we speak. They are engineers, Cornelius. Real engineers. Not golfers. Not politicians. People who know the difference between a turbine blade and a profit margin. And their first order of business is to cooperate fully with the federal investigation into your fraud. Cornelius collapsed. It wasn't a dramatic movie-style faint. His legs simply gave out. He sat back down heavily, his head lolling forward, his breathing ragged. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Beatrice screamed his name and rushed to his side, but her eyes were darting around the room, looking for an exit, looking for a way to salvage herself from the wreckage. Julian Thorne was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. I need to go, he stammered, standing up on wobbly legs. I have rights. I need to call my lawyer. You can call him from the back of the squad car, I said. The police are at the door, Julian. And I gave them the encryption keys to your private server, the one where you keep the double books, the one where you hide the money you stole from the pension funds. Julian let out a sob. He looked at the door, then at the window, realizing there was nowhere to run. I stood alone in the center of the chaos. I felt a strange sense of calm. The anger was gone. The resentment was gone. All that was left was the clarity of the aftermath. I had dropped the bomb, and now I was watching the dust settle. $15 billion, Evelyn whispered again. She looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it regret? Was it greed? It didn't matter. It was too late. It is not the money, Evelyn, I said, picking up my satchel. You still do not get it. It was never about the money. I would have lived in that garage with you forever. I would have been happy driving that old truck until the wheels fell off as long as I had you. The money was just a tool. It was a safety net I hoped we would never need. But you fell in love with the net, and you forgot about the man holding it. I walked over to her. I stood close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume, a scent that used to make my heart race, but now just smelled like chemicals. You wanted a divorce, I said. You wanted a clean break. You have it. I am keeping the company. I am keeping the patents. I am keeping the $15 billion. And you can keep the check. I pointed to the $500,000 check on the table. Take it, I said. It is generous. It is more than you deserve. Consider it a severance package for a job poorly done. Evelyn stared at the check. Then she looked at me, her eyes pleading. Arthur, please, we can talk. We can fix this. The baby? The baby will be taken care of, I said. If it is mine, I will ensure it has everything it needs. Education, opportunity, truth. But it will not be raised in this house. It will not be raised by these people. And it will certainly not be raised to believe that a man's worth is measured by the cleanliness of his hands. I turned away from her. The spell was broken. The connection was severed. I was no longer the husband. I was the CEO. I was the majority shareholder. And I had a company to clean up. The front doors of the manor burst open. I heard heavy boots on the marble floor. Uniformed officers, followed by men in the windbreakers of federal agents, poured into the hallway. In here, I called out, my voice authoritative. The individuals you are looking for are at the table. I watched as the agents entered the room. Julian Thorne put his hands up, sobbing. Cornelius Vane sat motionless, a broken king on a toppled throne. Evelyn sat frozen, her hand hovering over the check caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. I adjusted the collar of my flannel shirt. I didn't need a suit to command this room. I didn't need a tie to be the most powerful man in the building. I just needed the truth. And the truth was, I had just executed the most hostile takeover in corporate history, and I hadn't even finished my dinner. I stood amidst the wreckage of the dinner party, the flashing blue lights from the driveway strobing across the walls like a disco for the damned. The agents moved with professional efficiency, separating Julian Thorne and Cornelius Vane. Julian was weeping a guttural, undignified sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Cornelius was silent, his eyes glazed, staring at a future that had abruptly ceased to exist. "Do not arrest them yet," I said. My voice cut through the chaos, calm and commanding. The lead agent, a man with a square jaw and FBI emblazoned on his jacket, paused. He looked at me then, at the tablet in his hand, which undoubtedly displayed my clearance level and ownership status. He nodded once and signaled his team to hold. "I am not just pressing charges," I said, looking down at Cornelius. "I am restructuring, and the shareholders deserve to see the demolition." I picked up the satellite phone again. The line was still open. "Command," I said. "Execute Phase 2. Immediate dissolution of the Board of Directors. Activate the emergency bylaws. Section 4, Paragraph 3, Removal for cause. Cite gross negligence, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." "Confirmed," the voice on the other end replied. "Notices are being sent to all board members via secure courier and email. The press release is queued for the wire services." "Send it," I said. Cornelius flinched as if I had slapped him. You cannot dissolve the board," he whispered. "They are my friends. They are accomplices," I corrected him. "And as of right now, they are unemployed. Their stock options canceled. Their golden parachutes voided. I am stripping them of everything, Cornelius. I am clawing back every bonus paid out in the last 5 years under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. You are not just fired. You are being erased." I turned to Julian. He was shaking his hands, cuffed behind his back, snot running down his nose. "And you, Julian," I said. "I just forwarded the forensic audit of your Cayman accounts to the IRS Criminal Division. They are very interested in the $12 million you laundered last year. I imagine your investors will be calling soon. Or perhaps their lawyers." Julian's knees buckled. The agents had to hold him up. Then there was movement to my left. A blur of silk and desperation. Evelyn threw herself at me. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into the flannel of my shirt. Her face was a mask of terror, tears smearing her mascara into black streaks. "Arthur, stop, please," she screamed. "You are destroying us. You are destroying everything. My father, he is an old man. He will die in prison. And Julian, Arthur, please. Think about the baby. Think about our family." I looked down at her hands clutching my arm. The same hands that had pushed away my touch for months. The same hands that had signed the text messages mocking me to her friends. I did not feel pity. I did not feel love. I felt physics. I felt the repulsion of opposite poles. I pulled my arm away. It was a sharp, violent motion. She stumbled back, losing her balance in her high heels, catching herself on the edge of the table. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was low, dangerous. "You lost the right to touch me the moment you let them put that check on the table." "I am your wife," she sobbed. "I am carrying your child, Arthur. We can fix this. I made a mistake. I was confused. I love you. I have always loved you." "Liar," I said. The word hung in the air, absolute and final. "You love the safety I provided," I said. "You love the idea of being a rebel, as long as you had a safety net. But when the net started to look a little worn, when the truck got a little too rusty, you decided to trade up. You didn't choose Julian because you loved him. You chose him because he looked like a better insurance policy." I stepped closer to her, invading her space, forcing her to look at the man she had discarded. "You love the name Vane," I said. "You love the status. You love the way the valet opens the door for you. Well, congratulations, Evelyn. You can keep the name. You can be Mrs. Evelyn Vane for the rest of your life. Because that name is about to become synonymous with the biggest corporate fraud in the last decade. It is going to be a punchline on late-night television. It is going to be a warning label in business schools." "No," she moaned, shaking her head. No. And the money. I continued relentless. The $15 billion. It stays with me. The trust funds frozen. The estate seized. I walked back to the table. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen that had been lying next to the separation agreement. The pen Cornelius had expected me to use to sign away my life for pennies. I opened the blue folder. I found the signature line. "You wanted a divorce," I said. "You wanted it quick. You wanted it clean." I signed my name. Arthur Penhaligon. The signature was bold aggressive, taking up half the page. Then I took the pen and drew a thick black line through the $500,000 figure. Next to it in block letters, I wrote 0. I flipped to the asset division page. I crossed out the paragraphs about spousal support. I crossed out the clauses about the house. I wrote per prenuptial agreement, separate property, remains separate. I threw the pen down. It bounced off the table and skittered across the floor. "I signed a prenuptial agreement 19 years ago," I said to the room. "Do you remember, Cornelius? You insisted on it. You wanted to protect the Vane fortune from the mechanic." Cornelius looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden horrifying memory. "Yes," I said, seeing the realization hit him. "I signed it. It stated that whatever assets we brought into the marriage remained ours. Whatever we acquired separately remained ours. You thought you were protecting your millions. You didn't know you were protecting my billions." I looked at Evelyn. "You get nothing," I said. "The house is mine. The company is mine. The patents are mine. You leave this marriage exactly as you entered it, with your name and your clothes." "You can't leave me with nothing," Evelyn shrieked. "I am pregnant. You have to support me." "If the child is mine," I said coldly, "I will support the child. I will set up a trust. I will pay for the best schools. But not a single dime will go to you. Not for rent. Not for clothes. Not for your country club dues. You are on your own, Evelyn. Welcome to the working class. I hear there are openings for waitresses in New Haven. The tips are decent if you hustle." I turned to the lead agent. "Get them out of here," I said. "They are trespassing on private property." "Yes, sir," the agent said. He motioned to his men. They hauled Julian up. He was dead weight, his legs dragging on the expensive rug. "My career," he wailed. "My reputation." They took Cornelius next. He didn't fight. He looked shrunken like a balloon that had lost all its air. He looked at me one last time as they led him past. "Maxwell," he whispered. "Why?" "Because you forgot the first rule of mechanics," I said. "You forgot to check the integrity of the bolt before you applied the load." And then they took Evelyn. She didn't scream anymore. She just looked at me. A look of total devastation. She reached out a hand, one last desperate grasp at the life she had destroyed. "Arthur!" I turned my back on her. I walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. I watched as they were loaded into the back of the black SUVs. I watched the blue lights reflect off the chrome bumper of my Ford F-150. The truck looked good, solid, honest. I heard the front door close. The silence returned to the house. But it wasn't the heavy silence of oppression anymore. It was the clean, empty silence of a space that has been purged. I was alone in a mansion worth $20 million, the owner of a company worth $15 billion. But as I stood there rolling down the sleeves of my flannel shirt, I didn't feel like a billionaire. I felt like a mechanic who had just finished a very long, very dirty job. I picked up the separation agreement. I folded it and put it in my pocket. I would need to file it in the morning. Then I walked out of the dining room. I didn't look back at the spilled wine or the overturned chair. I walked through the foyer past the portraits of the Vane ancestors who were probably spinning in their graves. I stepped out into the cold night air. The wind felt good on my face. It felt like freedom. I walked past the Rolls-Royce, past the Bentley, past the Ferrari. I walked to my truck. I opened the door and climbed in. The seat squeaked a familiar, comforting sound. The cab smelled of old coffee and oil. I put the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty rumble that I had tuned to perfection. I put it in gear and drove down the long driveway past the gate where the guard, now looking very confused and frightened, saluted me as I passed. I turned onto the road, leaving Vane Manor behind in the rearview mirror. I was heading back to the garage, back to my tools, back to the work, because at the end of the day, machines don't lie. Money does, people do, but a well-built engine, it just runs, and I had a lot of running left to do. The heavy oak doors of Vane Manor closed behind me with a final resonant thud that felt less like a door shutting and more like the lid of a coffin falling into place. I stood for a moment on the granite steps, the cold night air of November hitting my face. It was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the stifling perfumed air inside the house air that had been thick with lies, greed, and the rotting stench of a decaying dynasty. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. It was the smell of reality. Below me, the driveway was a theater of chaotic justice. The quiet elegance of the Greenwich estate had been shattered by the strobe light effect of a dozen police cruisers and federal SUVs. The red and blue lights danced across the manicured lawns, and the stone facade of the house turning the scene into a surreal, silent film of destruction. I watched as the agents brought them out. First was Julian Thorne, the man who had sat at the dinner table an hour ago mocking my clothes, and my career was now a weeping mess. His expensive Italian suit was rumpled, the jacket pulled awkwardly tight by the handcuffs behind his back. He was not walking. He was being dragged, his legs useless, his feet scraping against the gravel. He was shouting something about due process, about his lawyers, but his voice was thin and hysterical, swallowed by the vast indifference of the night. I watched him being shoved into the back of a squad car, his head pushed down by an officer's hand to protect it from the doorframe, a courtesy he had never extended to anyone in his life. Then came Cornelius Vane, the patriarch, the titan of industry, the man who had looked at me for 20 years with eyes full of disappointment. He walked slowly, flanked by 2 federal agents who looked young enough to be his grandsons. He was not struggling. He was not shouting. He looked like a man who had suffered a stroke, his face slack, his eyes fixed on some distant point in the darkness. He had spent his life building a monument to himself, believing he was the architect of a great legacy. Now he was just an old man in a cardigan shivering in the wind, realizing that the foundation of his monument had been made of sand and the tide had finally come in. And then there was Evelyn. She was not in handcuffs. The law does not arrest you for being shallow. It does not arrest you for betraying your husband or for valuing status over substance. Her punishment was different. Her punishment was freedom, the freedom to stand in the wreckage of the world she had chosen with absolutely nothing to show for it. She stood in the open doorway framed by the light from the foyer. She was clutching the door frame as if it were the only solid thing left in the universe. She looked at the police cars. She looked at her father being loaded into a vehicle like a common criminal. She looked at Julian, the golden ticket that had turned out to be counterfeit. And then she looked at me. Our eyes met across the expanse of the driveway. In the harsh glare of the police lights, I saw her clearly. I saw the fear. I saw the confusion. But mostly I saw the sudden, terrifying realization of what she had thrown away. She looked at my flannel shirt, my work boots, my rough hands, and for the first time she didn't see a mechanic. She saw the only man who had ever truly loved her. She saw the safety she had craved, the strength she had relied on, and the $15 billion she had forfeited because she couldn't see past the surface. "Arthur!" she screamed. It was a raw, primal sound. It was the sound of someone realizing they are drowning, and the lifeboat is sailing away. "Arthur, don't go. Please, I'm sorry, we can fix this." She started to run down the steps, her high heels clattering on the stone. She stumbled, nearly falling, but caught herself and kept coming, reaching out toward me with desperate hands. I did not move toward her. I did not flinch. I simply watched her approach, feeling a profound sense of detachment. It wasn't anger. Anger implies passion. Anger implies that there is still a connection to be burned. This was different. This was the cold, clinical observation of a mechanic looking at a part that has failed beyond repair. There is no use getting angry at a broken piston. You simply remove it. She stopped 5 feet away from me, panting, tears streaming down her face, ruining the makeup she had applied so carefully for Julian. "Arthur, please," she sobbed, her chest heaving. "You can't leave me like this. The baby? Think of the baby. You're a good man. I know you're a good man. You wouldn't abandon your own child." I looked at her. I looked at the woman I had shared a bed with for 18 years. The woman I had protected from the harsh realities of her father's failures. The woman I had built a shadow empire to save. "I am a good man, Evelyn," I said. My voice was calm, steady, audible even over the idling engines of the police cars. "That is why I am walking away. Because a good man knows when his presence is no longer a gift, but an enablement." "But I love you," she cried, grabbing at my sleeve. "I've always loved you. I was lost. My mother, my father, they pressured me. It wasn't me, Arthur. It was them." I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. The contact felt alien. "It is always someone else, isn't it?" I asked softly. "It is always the pressure, the expectations, the society. You never took responsibility for your own heart, Evelyn. You let them tell you what to value, and now you are paying the price for their appraisal." "I can change," she pleaded. "I can be the wife you wanted. We can go back to the garage. We can drive the truck. I don't care about the money, I swear, Arthur. I don't care about the money." I smiled a sad, weary smile. "You care about the money, Evelyn," I said. "You just realize that I am the one who has it. If I were standing here broke, if the check on that table was the only thing between you and poverty, you would have signed it and never looked back. You are not crying because you lost me. You are crying because you bet on the wrong horse." "That's not true," she wailed. "It is true," I said. "And the tragedy is, you don't even know it." I turned away from her. I walked toward my truck. The Ford F-150 sat in the driveway, surrounded by the sleek black government vehicles. It looked out of place, a relic of a different world. It was rusted around the wheel wells. The paint was faded. The bumper was dented. But as I approached it, it looked like a chariot. It looked like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, because it was the only honest thing in Greenwich, Connecticut. I opened the door. The hinge creaked, a sound I had been meaning to fix for months, but tonight I decided I liked it. It was a real sound. "Arthur!" Evelyn screamed again, her voice cracking. She had collapsed onto her knees on the gravel, weeping into her hands. I climbed into the cab. The seat was cold. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, old grease, and hard work. I shut the door, cutting off the sound of her crying. The silence inside the truck was instantaneous and heavy. It was a sanctuary. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. It was a V8, powerful and loud. I felt the vibration of the pistons through the steering wheel, traveling up my arms, grounding me. This was my language. Torque, combustion, compression. Things that obeyed the laws of physics. Things that didn't lie. I put the truck in gear and eased off the clutch. I didn't spin the tires. I didn't make a scene. I simply drove. I drove past Evelyn, who was still kneeling on the ground, a statue of regret illuminated by police lights. I drove past the squad car where Julian Thorne was pressing his face against the glass, watching his future disappear. I drove past the federal agents who were leading Cornelius Vane away. I drove through the massive iron gates of Vane Manor, the gates that had been meant to keep people like me out, but had only succeeded in locking the rot inside. I turned onto the winding road that led back to the highway. I watched in the rearview mirror as the lights of the estate faded into the distance, becoming nothing more than a blur of red and blue against the black sky. As the miles ticked by, I felt a physical sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain. It was the sensation of a great weight being lifted. For 18 years, I had been carrying the Vane family on my back. I had been shoring up their crumbling walls, patching their leaking roof, and paying their debts, all while they spat on me from the balcony. Now the weight was gone. I reached over and touched the passenger seat. It was empty. For the first time in a long time, the emptiness didn't feel lonely. It felt spacious. It felt like room to breathe. People often talk about revenge. They call it sweet. They write movies about it where the hero destroys his enemies and walks away laughing. But they are wrong. Revenge isn't sweet. Revenge is heavy. It is work. It is a dirty mechanical process of dismantling a structure that should never have been built in the first place. I didn't destroy Cornelius Vane because I hated him. Hate is an emotional investment, and he was no longer worth the expenditure of my energy. I didn't destroy Julian Thorne because I was jealous. Jealousy implies that he had something I wanted. No, this wasn't revenge. This was maintenance. When a part in an engine becomes defective when it starts to grind against the other gears, causing friction and heat, you don't hate the part. You don't scream at it. You identify it. You isolate it. And you remove it. You cut it out before it destroys the entire machine. That is what I had done. I had performed a surgical extraction of a cancer that was killing my life. I was 64 years old. I had $15 billion in the bank. I owned patents that would define the next century of aviation. But as I drove down the dark highway, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt, I knew that none of that defined me. If I had wanted to, I could have bought a new life tomorrow. I could have bought a yacht, a private island, a fleet of Ferraris. I could have become the man they pretended to be. But I wouldn't. I glanced down at my hands on the steering wheel. They were still stained with grease. They were still rough. They were still the hands of a maker. I would go back to my garage. I would finish calibrating the fuel valve for the 1962 turbojet. I would wake up tomorrow and make my own coffee. I would drive this truck until it wouldn't run anymore, and then I would fix it and drive it some more. Because that is who I am. I am Arthur Penhaligon. I am not the billionaire investor. I am not the discarded husband. I am the mechanic. And for the first time in 18 years, the machine of my life was running perfectly. Smooth, quiet, efficient. The road ahead was dark, stretching out into the unknown. But the headlights of my Ford F-150 cut through the blackness, two beams of unwavering light guiding me home. I wasn't looking back at the rearview mirror anymore. There was nothing back there for me but ruins. Ahead of me, there was only the road, the hum of the engine, and the peace of a man who has finally learned the most important lesson of all. Self-preservation is not cruelty. It is not selfishness. It is the highest form of self-respect. You cannot save people who are determined to drown, especially when they are trying to use you as a stepping stone to keep their heads above water. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let go of the hand that is pulling you down. I shifted gears, the engine revving higher as I accelerated onto the open highway. The speedometer climbed. 50, 60, 70. I was moving forward, and I wasn't stopping for anyone. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It has been a long journey, and I appreciate you sticking with me until the end. I am curious to know where you are tuning in from right now. Drop a comment below with your city or country, and let me know what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice and turning the tables, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, Bittersweet Revenge. Hit that like button to help support the channel, and don't forget to press the hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people. Your support means the world to me. Stay safe, stay smart, And remember, never underestimate the quiet ones.